Hey, ladies and gents, welcome to the Controlled Interest Gamecast, where we talk about video games and everything happening in the industry. I am your host, Jerrad Wyche, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Dominic Rolando.
Definitely don't ever talk about football. Never. It doesn't happen here.
Ever, never, ever. This is solely a video game podcast. We are not allowed. But this week we have a special episode. There wasn't a whole lot of super interesting news in the gaming world. There was some stuff announced about Don't Nod and the bickering between PlayStation and Xbox for the Activision deal and all that stuff, but nothing super interesting that we haven't already touched on weeks before. So I wanted to make this the Halloween episode where we talk about horror games and Halloween specific stuff as they relate to video games. So I have a list of some stuff I wanted to talk about. But first off, the simplest thing, are you pro Halloween, anti Halloween? Where do you fit in that scale there, Dom?
To put it conservatively, it's spooky season. Let's go. Hell yes, I'm pro Halloween. Absolutely, all day.
Yeah, this stretch is probably my favorite time of the year for obviously football and it being fall, which is my favorite type of weather, fall into winter. I love the cold, and then obviously football and stuff. But also, we get a lot of video game releases. But in terms of strictly holidays, we get the trifecta, which I love. I'm a big Halloween person. I love Halloween. I'm not necessarily the type that likes to dress up and go out and trick or treat, but the whole vibes of the Halloween season I really love.
Yeah.
Thanksgiving, obviously undefeated. Oftentimes, depending on the family you have or you yourself, it's some of the best food you'll have all year. And then Christmas is a good time too. The music, the vibes, all of that stuff. So I'm pretty excited we're getting into the stretch. I'm pro Halloween as well. Yeah, I just don't know why anybody would be. I get maybe not liking Halloween if you're a scaredy cat and you just don't like being, you're not a horror movie person or horror games or anything like that. But the curmudgeons who are like, no decorating, no none of this, no none of that. It's like, come on now, find some happiness somewhere. Why do you always got to be like that?
Halloween is what it's about. This is the time of year. I'm with you.
Yeah, exactly. So for the Halloween Spectacular episode, or Spooktacular episode, so in honor of the spooky season and a lack of exciting gaming news this week, I thought we'd spend this time going over plenty of discussions and opinions regarding the niche but beloved horror gaming genre. So I want to start off with this. What thematic genre or game genre do we think makes the scariest combination when horror is added to it? So thematic genre being sci-fi, historical fiction, all of that stuff. And then gaming genre obviously being the gaming genre. So I have a couple examples. I'll start with my first one for each of them, and then you can give me yours, Dom. Obviously, we might have similar answers. There might not be a lot of answers here. But for me, the first one, I mentioned it, science fiction. I think science fiction horror is really good because science fiction in general has a lot to do with the unknown and humans dealing with the unknown of space and what's going on in technology. So when you add in those horror elements, they work really well together because horror is a lot of the unknown and dealing with that. And I think it plays on human discovery. Whenever if, for instance, like Dead Space, where you're in a spooky ship and things aren't working well, it's not like a horror story necessarily happening on Earth where you're in a haunted mansion and you can leave the mansion and get to safety because it's the confines of what you know as a human. When it's sci-fi and things are not necessarily easy or understood or safe to any extent, it's like, oh, you're in the middle of space or you're on this deserted alien planet or all this stuff. That's where I think it gets really good. What about you? Would you agree science fiction, when you add horror to it, is pretty solid?
And that's actually kind of the subgenre of it that I'm not as familiar with. Obviously I do love Dead Space, of course, and so that's perfect example. But getting into movies and stuff, I don't know that I've seen too much that uses horror to riff off of sci-fi elements. But it definitely makes sense what you're saying, because you kind of you get to use fictional devices, but they're explained and they do have their limits and rules. It's not like supernatural stuff where there are no clear rules or limits. And so sometimes I do get bummed out, maybe a little bit on the more supernatural stuff where it's you can kind of just do what you want, and there's no, because supernatural, so there aren't rules, we can't explain it. But at least sci-fi, there has to be at least theoretical reasons that this alien is as scary and dangerous as it is, or what have you. But I would say I really like anything like more historical, actually. So
I have
if we're,
historical fiction written down too.
yeah, that's always a good one because you're just limited as far as technology and resources, and oftentimes more isolated, just naturally, because that's how it was. Where I'm thinking in movies now too, but in more modern horror movies, like usually you have to like do things to get the characters to be isolated and like write in an excuse to why their phones don't work and stuff like that. Whereas I think of something like The Witch. That movie was just, this family literally gets kind of shunned and out, sent out of their village, and they're just in the middle of colonial nowhere, just getting tormented. Even though that's also some supernatural stuff going on there, but the historical aspect of it, I think I really like that because it really is just freaky, and you really feel like you have nothing. There's no like, oh, if I could just get to the police station, it's, a couple blocks away, or it's kind of like you said, where like even like once you're outside of the confines of your horror house or whatever it is, now it's just kind of, the whole place is just scary. That whole time period a lot of times can be scary itself. So I think I really like that.
Yeah, it could be the middle of the day and people are just off put by what's going on. And I do think when directly comparing it to science fiction too, science fiction's like, oh, if only you had access to the laser gun or the this or the that.
Sure.
The lack of technology too plays a big role, like you said, where a lot of times it's like, oh, you need to fasten a spear or you need to find something. I've seen it very far and few between examples of this, but like high fantasy horror that's not so much fantasy but more historical based. I would love to see more in that space. Yeah. Because I do think there's a lot to work with there. Even stuff that could be naturally occurring that isn't so much supernatural. Like you can base a whole horror story set in historical time periods from the past based on like the plague or stuff like that, where it's going back to the misunderstanding of what's going on. I think that plays a lot in horror in general, of people not really knowing what's going on. So yeah, I'm with you on historical fiction. And then in terms of game genres, I think if the developers and designers are good enough at their job, I think they can make any genre work. But for me, I think the ones that are the easiest for a horror game to thrive in are first-person games, because obviously you have that direct immersion. And then when you throw in specifically either walking sims, where it's a slower pace and it's more creepy and it kind of builds on that tension, and then immersive sims too, which are kind of the same thing. I think third person can be scary, but I do think it's much harder. There are great examples of third person horror games, even if you go to like a 2D platformer like Little Nightmares. But I do think that one you have to rely a lot more on a controlled visual, because I guess in third person you're seeing a lot more of the world at one point, whereas with first person games you can directly control the cone in which the player sees, which can elevate the tension and the scare factor of like either jump scares or like fake outs and that type of stuff. So I would say first person is probably the ideal perspective in game genres, any kind of first person, either exploration or even shooter, if you look at like the Fear games.
Yeah, that's a good point, because as soon as you go out to third person, you just have obviously more vision than you have in first person and less immersion, but also you kind of have this like the vision part of it comes with this like unnatural godlike ability to like control the camera from behind the person. It's just easier to manipulate the situation when you're in third person, it feels like. Whereas in first person, you're very limited to like, what's in front of you, and that's it. So yeah, that vision thing I think just goes a long way.
Yeah, I wanted to get into specifically, I mentioned, game design and development for horror games. I want to talk about what aspects of that process do we think contribute to the best horror games. For me, I wrote down 4 things, and I want to know if you want to add to them or agree on them. So the 4 things I wrote down that, in my opinion, make the best horror experiences. First of all, I think sound design is the most important. I think it adds to basically the whole sense of atmosphere, I would say. I think atmosphere in general I also wrote down, but that's more of a vague one, because I think that adds in a lot of things. That adds in level design, that adds in gameplay design, that adds in sound design and pacing and all of that stuff. But for me, sound design is most critical, because I think if you can nail the sound design, uh you can make people scared without actually doing anything, right?
Right.
Um, just based on the environmental sound that's going on. I already mentioned an atmosphere, which is kind of more of a vague thing that kind of adds in a lot of stuff. Tension building, which is a huge part of horror. I think good horror. I mean, some stuff relies a little heavy on jump scares, and depending on what it is, whether a movie or a game, the specific one it is, I think it can work. But I do think it's the moments between those scares where the tension is building, which kind of goes into sound design and stuff like that, where you can really elevate how somebody's going to interact or react to the next scare that's planned or that can be uh, kind of instigated by the player. And then lastly, pacing. This kind of goes hand in hand with tension building, where I do think letting scares or tense moments breathe and you give the player this false sense of security between those bigger moments adds to the scare. I think the best horror movies and horror video games aren't the ones where you're constantly scared. It's the ones where when you do get scared, it's elevated to an extent in which you haven't felt before. And a lot of that has to do with both the tension building and the pacing between that. So I think that's also pretty important. But those are my four. So sound design, atmosphere, tension building, and pacing.
I think I really like pacing the most, and that's what I was going to add. You got it. But there's something about finding the right balance, the right give and take of the amount of power you give, sticking to games, you give the player. Thinking of something like a Resident Evil, where it's as much a survival game too, where like you're limited on ammo and the stuff you can do, and so that adds to that tension and everything else. But there also still has to be progression. You have to feel like you're getting somewhere. So that's kind of a hard balance to draw of like, well, we want you to feel like you're always a little underpowered and like your resources can't hold up to all the things around you. But we also got to make sure you're progressing and getting stronger at the same time. So that's like a hard thing to do for games especially. And then like kind of that still on the pacing thing and more of the part of it you're getting into, but that light at the end of the tunnel thing where like each, I recall playing, it's been a while. I'm excited for the Dead Space remake because it's been a while since I played it. But each of those levels was kind of, it ends with you getting back to your kind of shuttle. And then you get shuttled onto another level of the space station you're on. And each of those is like a checkpoint, right? You get to reload and fill your health up and all that kind of good stuff, and then you're going to a new area. And it always felt like a relief, like, oh, I got through that part. Like, oh man, that was messed up. I can't believe I started, that kind of relief. And then kind of again progressing, getting some upgrades and some things like that. But then you're put right into a new area where you start out feeling confident, but at the right pace, you have to start losing that confidence and have that dread start to build up, even though you kind of just went through that cycle of getting through something scary and then coming out. But it's just, that's the whole point of it, is kind of going through those cycles and progress, like all of that stuff. That's like crucial to game design for horror games. I don't know all the details and specifics about how they do it. I just know I like it when it's done well.
Well, and the funny thing too is horror games in a way are kind of the antithesis of general game design, because general game design is about a power fantasy, like letting the player feel as if they're fulfilling some sort of power fantasy, right? But with horror games, a lot of the time, they take that power away from you. Like, the whole point of it is you're powerless, right?
Yeah.
And it's you trying to overcome whatever's in your way. So I think that's really interesting, too. I split this next thing.
That's where you get into the difference between, like, a horror game versus a horror adventure or action adventure. Like a Resident Evil is more action adventure / horror, I guess. Something like a Outlast is just, that's just horror because you have no weapons or anything. So hey, that's kind of I guess that's a good job by genres describing things for us.
Yeah, survival horror versus this next category I kind of split into two. So one is going to be some scary moments in gaming, like specific moments in specific video games. And two is going to be characters, bosses, or enemies I wrote down that are maybe they're equal parts like scary or disturbing or off-putting. So the first one I have here is any scare in PT. And any scare in PT qualifies for this. That game is demo is very good at pacing, tension building, all the stuff we talked about. It's very creepy, and yeah, any time Lisa scares you in that game, it's absolutely horrifying. I'm gonna go through them, and then you can mention which ones were your favorite or any you want to add. Next up, an underrated one, the Man Bat jump scare in Arkham Knight, I think is really good. When you're just flying around the city, and then out of nowhere he pops up on the top of a building to scare you. I thought that was really well done, and a lot of people didn't expect that. Um, Speaking of Dead Space, the elevator necromorph at the beginning of the game when you're getting into the elevator and it opens up the elevator door and is like spinning and twisting to try to get
I
inside.
think I remember that. Yeah.
Yeah, pretty terrifying. Um, what else? Oh, so this one is not a specific moment, but it is. So in Bloodborne, is what's the name of the? Is it intellect? The stuff you gather?
Insight.
Insight. When you have enough insight and the monsters of madness appear in the world,
Yes. Oh.
that is terrifying from the sense of like personal privacy and not understanding the world around you. Of like, oh, this entire time there have been
Right.
these things around me and I just couldn't see them.
When
And
you
that's some of the
realize that.
scariest stuff. Yeah.
Ooh, that's a good one. I hadn't thought of that. I was thinking in Dead Space. Actually, it might be Dead Space 2, where it's not a jump scare or anything weird, but it's when you have to like use that needle device to poke into your own eyeball.
Yep.
Oh man, that's just and it's so like detailed, and yup, it goes right in there, and you're controlling it's like a crane game, but with Isaac's eyeball. Weird.
Two more moments I have. The Margaret Baker jump scare in RE7 when you are just walking around the back end of the more swampy area of the house and she like pops up out of nowhere with her creepy ass face. And this one's a little bit more specific too. The first time you run into a Big Daddy in BioShock, I think is pretty scary. They're just their weight and mass, and they did a good job of designing that. Also from a sound design perspective as well. So those are the moments. I'm gonna get to the characters real quick, and then we'll get to you if you want to add any on either of them, Dom. So I wrote down Gaping Dragon. To me, Gaping Dragon from the original
Yeah.
Dark Souls has always been one of the more grotesque designs in all of Dark Souls. It's just this weird dragon that can flip on its back. Its entire body is kind of exposed as teeth. I think it's a really good design. The way it creeps up off of that waterfall and you barely see its head first, and then it fully reveals itself. Add into it, like spews that acid in its own little boss dungeon. Um, any of the giant rats in any of the Souls games are pretty gross too. I didn't write that down, but I just thought of that. Angie from Resident Evil Village, just creepy dolls are an easy go-to for horror, and that thing is really awful. Orphan of Cause is pretty disturbing, just based on the environmental design of that boss, and then when you find out the story about him as well, just the giant dead horse laying on the beach is pretty gross. Yeah, and then obviously anybody I've mentioned as a jump scare, so like Margaret Baker, so on and so forth. Is there anything there you want to add? Any bosses, enemies, characters, or moments that stand out?
Yeah, definitely. And like what I'm going to notice here is, or what I'm just not noticing is, it's interesting when you have a game that is like through and through horror, like a Dead Space, Resident Evil, versus something more like a Dark Souls, where there's just sections of that game that are particularly spooky. So another one to add is when you empty out, you open a dam basically, or a big door that's a dam, and then you can now go into the New Londo ruins, and it's just so creepy down there, and all the enemies are these very transparent ghosts that, unless you have the right
specters, yeah,
you can't hurt them, and so they seem weak, but then they can like latch onto you and do big damage, that kind of thing. But that whole section is just very creepy and well done, and the boss of that section too, where you dive into a pit where you normally think you would die, but if you, again, wearing the right item that you get from our boy Artorias, then you survive and face the boss down there, the Four Kings, who you fight just in the abyss, both literally, and that's what it looks like. It's just black. There's no edges, there's no platforms, there's nothing. It's just black, and it's just you and these bosses, and that whole thing is just messed up, and it's pretty cool. I'd also add in Zelda Ocarina of Time, there's a couple moments of, first of all, those enemies, they're called Redeads, just like plain looking zombie dudes, just naked zombies, basically. But if you run through their field of vision, or it's more like a line, if you run across their eye line, they'll freeze you, and you're just stuck in place while they slowly creep towards you. And as soon as like they freeze you, they let out this like high pitched screech when it happens, and you're just stuck, and your controller's not working, and this thing is just slowly creeping towards you, and you're like, oh my god, I can't get out. What am I gonna do? If he was far enough away, you'll be able to break free, but if not, he just jumps and wraps his arms and legs around you, and just sucks off half your health or whatever. So those re-deads from Ocarina of Time are always spooky. And then also, like, in that same game, one of the temples you go to, you access at the bottom of this well in Kakariko Village. So like the Shadow Temple is how you get to it, and that whole temple itself is spooky, kind of like Bloodborne. You get a device that lets you see things that you couldn't see otherwise. So like that adds to it, and the whole thing is just dark and spooky, and all sorts of creepy stuff in that whole level we could go on about. But yeah, Dark Souls, Ocarina of Time both do a lot of things like that are, the rest of Zelda game is just bright and colorful, nice fields and things like that. But then there's sections that get spooky. And I think that's cool when it's done right. It can be very effective. Same with Dark Souls and many others.
Well, even I forget the name of the undead caves in the first Dark Souls, where it's like pitch black and you can just see the skeletons creep out of the darkness, is pretty terrifying.
That's a good one.
Another one that I think is a double scare for specific people, but definitely a single scare for most people playing Dark Souls, is the frogs that basically turn you to stone. Yeah. There's a lot of people who get scared of those things because they do look weird, very off-putting when you first see them with their giant fake eyes, their mimic eyes. But then they become even more terrifying when you find out what they're actually capable of. So that's pretty funny. Talking about Legend of Zelda, I think one thing too that's pretty interesting with video games is the unintentionally horrifying and scary parts of them. I knew somebody who developed a fear of deep water, Dom, because of the section in Super Mario 64 where you run into that giant eel, the really big eel underwater.
Yes, yeah.
And they played it as a child, they became absolutely terrified, and they've had a fear of deep water ever since, and that thing still bothers them. So I think that's pretty good to mention there as well, because especially when you're a kid, man, I imagine there's tons of kids growing up who played like Minecraft, who got into a dark cave system and ran into a bat or a creeper and absolutely terrified them. Like, yeah, it's funny how sometimes just game design in general can make things terrifying. Another moment I wanted to mention, pretty iconic scary moment in video games, is in Fear, when you're climbing down a ladder and the like ghost girl pops up at the top of the ladder as you're going down, and she laughs very creepily. Very, very terrifying. I mean, Fear in general, I think, is pretty underrated in terms of horror games, because it's like, it's a first-person shooter. It's like, yeah, but it's also a horror trilogy. It's very off-putting. Because that's the whole thing with the power dynamic, right? Is whenever you play a video game where you have a gun, you're like, I don't have to worry,
Right. But you have like a full assault rifle in that game. Like, you're like very armed, and yet it's terrifying. That's the remaster we need. We need Fear. Let's go in on this.
We need Fear.
Kickstart it.
So let's make a list of the best horror games, whether scariest or best in genre. So it doesn't necessarily have to be something that scared you the most. It's just like, this is just a great horror game. I've listed some. You'll probably have some of these as well, Dom, on your mind. And if I miss any, please feel free to mention them too. So first off, I have Until Dawn. This goes in the category of one of the best in genre. I don't think Until Dawn is necessarily like scary, but I do think as a horror piece of entertainment, I think it does a really good job. I would possibly still consider it. Let me think. I haven't finished The Quarry. I would still consider it probably Supermassive's best work, in my opinion. Out of all of the anthology stuff in it, I'd probably say it's my favorite. What about you? Not excluding The Quarry, because I don't have a argument in that because I haven't finished it yet.
Yeah, that would be the only contender. And it's been too long since I played Until Dawn, but I think I might like The Quarry better. But obviously, yeah. So I naturally recommend it to you.
Yeah. We'll add The Quarry on this list too then. That naturally makes sense. I'm assuming you'd have it on this list, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Next up, Little Nightmares 1 and 2 for me. I think these are great because they take a genre that normally isn't attached to horror games, 2D platformers, and they make it work. They're creepy, they're mysterious, you don't exactly know what's going on. The claymation they use for the enemies in these games is nasty in the best way possible. Um, Whenever you're a character who is both thematically and literally smaller than everything else in the world around you, I think that's a good way to induce a sense of hopelessness, and that's why I think it works so well. Um, I don't have these on the list because I wouldn't consider them horror games, but I do think Limbo and Inside have a lot of horror elements to them, a
I
lot of
was thinking
scary
about
parts.
Inside.
Limbo more so than Inside, I think. I don't know. The kid, the long haired like mermaid kid, is pretty terrifying in Inside, especially with the physics. Like going back to Dark Souls, Dom, with the weird spider ladies. Anytime there's like long hair in water, it's super weird to me. I don't like it. Like a lot of hair in water,
Hmm.
just not a vibe I'm looking for.
The way it kind of
Um,
fans out and gets all stringy and like diluted looking.
yeah, exactly. Just unnatural. PT, of course, not technically a game, but like any list involving horror video games has to have PT on it, and it's such a shame we never got the full game. What could have been. Next up, Dead Space. For me personally, I'd say Dead Space 1 and 2. 3, obviously, I don't have to go on about how it kind of lost the core of what Dead Space was. Hopefully, remake will be on this list too in the future, and Callisto Protocol, Dom. That'd be awesome if we both consider those really good. I mean, the first Dead Space remake, I don't think they can really mess that up too much.
Hmm.
This one was interesting. So, doing research for this podcast, I came across a PS2 game that I completely eliminated from my mind and forgot playing. Do you remember The Suffering?
No.
Google this game real quick. You might not have played it, you might have missed it. But I saw this name and I was like, whoa, that's a name I haven't heard in 2 decades. And I looked it up and it all came back to me. It's a horror game where you play as this guy escaping prison and like everyone's like weird mutated monsters and stuff. And I remember being scared playing this game, but actually really enjoying my time with it. And yeah, it's a game I completely forgot about entirely. But the moment I saw the name The Suffering, it like I had like a That's So Raven moment where like you
Just all
know
came back to you.
yeah, exactly. So who knows if it's actually any good. I played it as a kid, but my kid brain absolutely thought it was the scariest thing ever. And I do think a prison is always a good setting for a good horror story. So
That's a good one too. Yeah, I don't think about that because you're obviously things are against you. There's cages all over and etc.
I only have a couple more left, and then you can add any that I'm missing here. Amnesia: The Dark Descent or Amnesia: Machine for Pigs. I think those games are really good. They're more in the Outlast, which I also have on this list, type of horror games where you don't really have anything to fight back, and it's more about surviving and figuring out what's going on. Um, More psychological horror with Amnesia, and the story itself is crazy. Visage, which is a rather new one. Are you familiar with Visage?
No.
This is one that takes place in a single house. Uh, Very spooky. It's very dark. You can Google this one too. It got a lot of popularity because the demo came out for it and streamers and people were playing it. And it's really scary. There's like a camera you can use to record stuff. The tension and atmosphere in this game is pretty crazy. Uh, it's a small house that you walk back and forth, and you have to close doors and open doors and turn on lights and turn off lights. And yeah, it's pretty scary. Caught me by surprise.
Huh. I'm watching some gameplays. Yeah, it's just a ceiling fan going. Really creepy. But I'm not, yeah, this is that and The Suffering. I've never heard of this. I gotta like get into deeper cuts with horror games. I guess.
Yeah, and I'm not trying to laud The Suffering as anything special. It just was one of those games you played as a kid that you completely forgot about. I was like, The Suffering. I saw that name. I
Yeah.
was like, is it what I think it is? Um, it's kind of like when I remembered what's the name? There's a 13 Ghosts, I think is the name of the horror movie. Have you ever seen that movie?
No.
So I saw that name, excuse me, and I was like, 13 Ghosts? What is that? And I Googled it, and I was like, I totally remember watching this horror movie. And it's about these people that have to go and like capture these 13 spirits, and then they find out they're all trapped underneath this like glass house. Uh It's kind of like Cabin in the Woods before Cabin in the Woods, but it isn't as like
Okay.
irreverent and meta as Cabin in the Woods, but kind of the
Sure.
same vibe of like, oh, we're gonna look at the horror tropes and kind of put our own twist on it. When I watched it, it was a good movie. Like I said, kid brain, you never know. um, and then so I already mentioned Outlast, Visage. Last one, I don't have a personal connection to this, but based on there's two of them. I don't have any personal connection to them, but based on what they did for both gaming and the horror space, Slenderman and Five Nights at Freddy's. Five Nights at Freddy's these days obviously gets a lot of hate, and people think it's cringy and all this stuff. But when it originally came out, it like captured the attention of like a certain age group across the world. Like kids were absolutely terrified of Five Nights at Freddy's. Just yeah, animatronics have always been creepy in general, so making a game based in that kind of world was a really smart idea. And then Slenderman, obviously the fascination with that led to the unfortunate circumstance of those two girls with mental illness killing that other girl and all that stuff. Like, obviously, I don't want to put a spotlight on that, but Slenderman in general has become a known horror entity, and I think that's all you can ask for when you're creating a horror property is like you mention the monster of it and people know what it is. Like you mentioned Slenderman, your mom might not know specifically what it looks like, but they're like, oh, the game that, and so on and so forth. So
Yeah.
I wanted to mention that as well.
And
And
so that's
BioShock,
pretty,
I guess I'll throw in. I mentioned it earlier, but I
yeah,
didn't mention it on this list.
because that is that I think that fits in horror, whereas I think Bloodborne is like maybe you wouldn't call it a horror game, but I think you could still.
Honestly, I think it depends on who you ask. I think for me
Yeah.
or you, we wouldn't necessarily consider it a horror
Sure.
game, but there's certain people out there that find that game terrifying. People find like the Dark Souls games scary too. I think
Yeah.
the perspective on that is there are some of those games where they, depending on who you ask, they might be considered horror games.
We talked about Fear. I would probably put that on my list because that was like that might have been like the first scary game I ever played on 360, and I didn't know what I was getting into. It was exhilarating, I guess is the best way to put it. But a big one that I definitely would add is Alan Wake. Absolutely adore
Good
that
point.
shit.
Yep.
Slightly different kind of thing. Not so much of the gruesome stuff as some of the other games we talked about, but got this cool like storytelling going on where your character is narrating along the way, and things are split up into chapters in a kind of cute way because he's an author, and things like that. You're limited on weapons, really. Like you just use a flashlight and a handgun, and that's kind of the flashlight is a pretty important mechanic. But like the way it all works, you're in this like small town and a lot of shadows. Really uses darkness and shadows to make it scary. Thus the flashlight being important. But yeah, I definitely couldn't go on without mentioning Alan Wake.
Before anybody comes at us, Dom and I have like no experience with Fatal Frame or Silent Hill either, so that's why neither of those are on the list. I mean, PT's technically Silent Hills, but yeah, that's why neither of those are on our list.
I was gonna say that because I never played any Silent Hill games, but that's probably on almost everyone else's list. But yeah, I've never.
Remember, this is our list of games we've played. So another one I think is borderline. It might have a case, Control, right there with Alan Wake. I think Control has some very scary parts, and a lot of it is the supernatural, right? I remember when you run across that guy who's not allowed to blink, and then when you leave, he like starts screaming for you to come back. Oh man, it's terrible, awful.
I would probably add myself, and it's tough between Resident Evil 7 and the remake of 2, but I'd probably go with 7 as a better horror game. 2 might be the better game overall, but as a horror game, 7 I think it's just a bit better. It's creepier the way the family is just so unhinged, and it doesn't rely so much on some of those sci-fi elements and some of the action stuff that the other Resident Evil games get into, that kind of thing.
I can't wait for us to play 4, the remake of 4. I'm really
Yes.
interested in that.
Oh, I'm super excited.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Going back to the idea of things that weren't supposed to be scary but were, what was pretty off-putting as a kid? Lavender Town in Pokemon, when you go to the cemetery, and if you were to pull up the music from Lavender Town, it's the most uneasy, music in Pokemon. A lot of Pokemon music is very good. It's cheerful, it's uplifting. You put on that Lavender soundtrack and you're going to feel uncomfortable. It's very good work. I mean, in general, anybody who made soundtracks for the original Game Boy or any of those limited devices is astounding, because you're working with so much little on the technology end of things, that the way in which you can get that many different songs that all sound uniquely their own is fascinating. But yeah, and you find out about like the dead, the Cubone and the dead Marowak, and you have to use like the Sylph scope to see the hidden ghosts and all of that stuff. I think it was pretty scary as a kid. Add on to the anime, the Sabrina episode, where like Haunter kills Ash and he becomes a ghost, and then Sabrina herself is like terrifying this weird goth girl, which probably spurred a lot of interest from either straight men or lesbian or bisexual women into a whole thing of being into emo girls. But like as a kid, it was terrifying. She was so weird and creepy, and yeah, ghost type Pokemon in general have always been really off-putting. I guess lastly, we kind of touched on this at the beginning of the episode in terms of like, did we like Halloween or did we not? I guess we can give me one of your favorite Halloween memories, if you have one.
Ooh.
And if you want to think about it, I can give you one of mine.
Yeah, you go first.
So my favorite Halloween memory, as I said, I was never somebody who like was super excited to dress up. I did as a kid for sure, but it wasn't like the thing I was into. I was more into like playing horror video games or horror movies, and just the whole vibe of the decorations and all of that stuff. Like, along with my dad, I just love decorating the house and scaring people. But I remember one time, so for context, my mom is a former, she's, what's the best way to phrase this? She worked at a high-end prison for a long time. So in criminal justice has kind of been her career path her entire life. So she's a very aware and astute person, and always assured of her surroundings. So as a kid, I was maybe like 7 or 8 years old. Me and my sister, she takes us to a haunted house. And now, basically, we're walking through this haunted house, getting scared, spooky, yada yada yada. Being a correctional officer like my mom, you have to be very reactive to things, right? So this guy went and grabbed her foot to scare her, and in the blink of an eye, she turned and cold cock kicked him in the face. Apologized to him afterwards profusely. She was so sorry about it, but it was one of the funniest moments because it was so reactionary. And as a kid, I was kind of like, I was terrified the entire time. But when my mom's foot got grabbed, just her immediate reaction. After that point, I was like, oh, I'm cool. I'm Gucci going into any of these places. I don't have to worry because there's nothing tries to grab me. My mom has it. But I thought it was so funny. I felt so bad for the guy, but fuck around and find out, I mean, it's his job. I'm making a joke of it. I'm making light of it. But yeah, it was really funny.
Okay, I'm glad you went first because that reminds me. We used to have in our town, and they got rid of it. It was not a haunted house, but the same idea, except it was through this forest, and there would be like
a pumpkin patch vibe type thing.
Yeah, something like that. And it was scary because you'd be kind of taken through it, guided by this like rope. So everyone is supposed to hold on to the rope. So that's kind of like
gotcha.
Your track, more or less, and whoever's at the front, I guess, knows where they're going, and you get pulled along a path and through different things they set up. Like some parts of it were indoors that you go through, and so it hit like all the different types of horror tropes. We had like clowns and chainsaws and all sorts of different stuff. They used to do that every year. It was so spooky. So I definitely remember doing that a couple times as a kid. The haunted houses are just cool. Like scary. Then they had to go and make movies about it though, going wrong. And now it's like, I don't know if I could ever do it again after seeing some of that.
Favorite Halloween costume as a kid?
Oh man, it's tough. Like,
my favorite one was corny. It was pretty corny, but I loved it. Zombie football player. My mom would do up my makeup to make me look like a zombie, and then I'd put on my Yaffle, which is our like youth football league, Yaffle football gear, and I was a zombie football player, and I loved it because I got to wear my football gear and I was a zombie. So as a kid, I was stoked.
That is a good one. I definitely, because I'm not big on costumes either. But I definitely remember one party in college, just full on did the whole Joker thing. Granted, not very original, of course, especially at that time. That's what everyone did. But I did go. I went and found a purple suit at Goodwill and got some temporary hair dye and all that kind of stuff and face paint. So it looked good. If not the most unique idea, but otherwise, I'm not sure. I remember being Jar Jar Binks when I was really young. And I'll stand up for
Little
that.
Dom as Jar Jar Binks. Oh man.
I'll stand up for that all day. And God bless you on my best because you're awesome. But
that's the most on-brand Dom costume I could have imagined.
Yeah.
You as Jar Jar Binks.
I think it was like kindergarten and first grade. I had that costume, and it was funny because it's what you think. He's just kind of wears like the silky black robe looking thing, but then the costume just like had a hood that went over your head, except it had this big flap of a mask in front of it with his long mouth. I don't know what you call it, but yeah.
Dude, that reminds me. My mom made me a Gimli costume.
Oh, nice.
And it was right when it had to be like right after Fellowship released, or maybe because what was that, 2001?
Sounds right.
Yeah, so I was like 10 or 11 or something, and I was like, I really want to be Gimli, the dwarf character, and she's like, okay. So she bought me an axe that looked similar, because at the time there wasn't like couldn't find like a Lord of the Rings costume like that.
Right.
So she bought me an axe. She bought me a fake beard that I put on, and then she went and got balloons and made a paper mache helmet, and me and her worked on it and painted it and stuff to make me a dwarven helmet, and it was really cool. I completely forgot about that until you mentioned the Jar Jar Binks one, because I was like, did I have any on-brand costumes as a kid? Because funny enough, as much as I love Pokemon, I never dressed up as like a Pokemon trainer, which in hindsight seems weird that I never did that.
Because that'd be easy enough.
But I guess you think about it, Pokemon came out like in 98, and then Lord of the Rings was in 2001, and the new trilogy was 99 was the first one for Star Wars?
Yeah, 99, yeah.
Yeah, so I might just have never had a chance to be the Pokemon trainer. Just so many other things caught my interest. But yeah, Gimli and the zombie football player were probably my favorites. Man, the number of people who dressed up as the guy from Scream 2, Jesus Christ.
Oh yeah,
that was like the most over.
Yeah, so easy.
Yeah,
such an easy costume.
You mentioned the Joker, and I was like, what was another overplayed costume? And it was like, yeah, the Scream person.
Yeah, because and it worked so well because that was in the movie where like they were all wearing it and going to Halloween parties wearing it. So it kind of like had that meta effect, even though it was like the simplest, most lazy costume you could get. I think it was effective. It was kind of cool.
While we close out and end the show, I kind of want to skip over what we've been playing to save that for next week when we talk about games. But before we go, Dom, I want you to recommend to listeners one game and one movie that they should watch this Halloween season.
Oh. I mean, we've talked about a lot of games. I want to think of something a little more, a little different. Because, like, probably Fear would have been the one I would have picked that, like, maybe not as many people have heard of. BioShock, we talked about. Man, actually, you know what I'm going to say? We never mentioned is, I'll say Dying Light. Granted, I've not played the newer one, but the original Dying Light, really great game just in general. Like, cool parkour, jumping around a city and killing zombies and stuff, but day-night cycle, and of course when it became nighttime, those zombies got way faster, way more aggressive, and there were more of them, and it was terrifying, and sometimes you get stuck out at night basically in the game, and it was a really cool mechanic and pretty unique, I think. So I'm gonna say play Dying Light. It's a good game, and to myself, I'm gonna get around to that sequel one of these days too. I don't even know what the subtitle is. It's not Dying Light 2, but for a movie, I'm going to ask you to go next and tell us a game while I figure out what movie I want to recommend.
My game is easy. It's a game that I think not enough people have played, and that's Little Nightmares 1 and 2. I think it's so unique that a 2D platformer can capture what a horror game is and do it effectively and do it well. And like Limbo and Inside, which I mentioned earlier in the show, I love games that have ambiguous endings and let you just sit with it and kind of understand from your own perspective what you think happened based on the information you gathered. And I think Little Nightmares 1 and 2 both do that really well, and the ties between them is really good. And you can probably get them pretty cheap at this point too. They're probably on some type of sale for the holiday or something, I'd imagine. I don't think they're on Game Pass, but yeah, I definitely recommend those two games.
And I might try those out then, because I've heard a bit. I mean, I don't think I've heard you talk about them till today, but they come up every so often, and they've definitely been on sale too. I think you're right, so I'm gonna have a look. But for a movie, I figured it out because it was obvious, and definitely my favorite horror movie of all time. I think that, I don't know. I'll think about that longer. Maybe I'll find something else, but definitely go see Get Out, or rent it at this point, of course. So more of a kind of obvious satirical horror movie, but just so well done, and the way it kind of picks on different types of people and different situations, and it's truly terrifying through a lot of it. Not overly gruesome, but really creepy, and I don't know. I just really liked it. I think for Jordan Peele's stuff, I think it was better than his second movie, Us. Yeah, I definitely recommend Get Out really to anybody to go see.
So I'm gonna cheat here. Get Out is great. It's a great recommendation, and not a traditional horror movie experience, but in the best way possible. I think. I really like that. I didn't even have that on my because I was looking up some.
You could
movies.
almost call it a suspense or a thriller. You might, but I still think it's still a horror movie.
I think most people who weren't happy about January 6th would consider it a horror movie.
yeah.
I'll just put it that way. So I'm gonna cheat, and I have 3. So
Okay,
my sci-fi one of my favorite sci-fi horror movies is A Quiet Place. Unfortunately, I still haven't gotten around to seeing the sequel. Still haven't seen it. First one I really love, though. I think in terms of tension building and stuff, I think it's such a neat concept. Really enjoyed it. A more heady one that I don't think is for everybody, but I absolutely loved it. And if you are the type of person who likes hard sci-fi, I think Annihilation is a really good movie. But that one is very heady. Yeah, and some people might not even consider it a horror movie, but I think there's elements to that are pretty terrifying. But my general recommendation that is the most traditionally horror movie and probably one of my favorites is Midsommar. That movie is wild. I love Florence Pugh as an actress. She does a phenomenal job. That movie just builds on itself. It's like slow build, slow build, slow build. Holy shit, like out of nowhere. Yeah, it's really good. I think it does a good job of leading the audience to have certain suspicions, and though some of those suspicions end up being true, it's not even to the extent you would even imagine. And I think the way it hits you in the face with some of its more shocking elements isn't like torture porn. It's really well done, and it's meant to be in that specific part of the movie to build towards what else it adds to the end of it. You're not going to leave that movie happy. I'll tell you that much.
For sure. Yeah.
But it is, I think, any piece of art that can instill and engage any sort of emotional reaction is effective, whether that's critically well received or not. And with Midsommar, if anything, that movie will leave you feeling something, and I think that's tremendous. And as a horror experience, I think it's really good. And I'm kind of bummed that I took so long to actually watch it because I'd heard so many good things about it.
I feel the exact same way about a different movie from that guy. I forget his name, but Hereditary.
Haven't watched it on my list.
Oh, I know at this point it's like it's the obvious pick, like, oh, you like A24 movies and horror or whatever, but like it's just good. I don't care. It's just incredible and just scary in all the right ways and unsettling in all the right ways. So it's similar to Midsommar in some of the ways it does like shocking things like that. But it's a different vibe overall, though. It's much like darker, where Midsommar is like mostly in daylight, which is kind of a cool thing about that one. But yeah, Hereditary is just, it's terrifying, like all the horror elements that you expect, but there's also, it does this kind of dread from a family element that has nothing to do with anything supernatural or otherwise. That's just terrifying and horrible.
Like generational despair is what I've heard. Like it kind of plays on that idea of like familial weight, essentially.
I don't want to say definitely watched it. Just watch it for sure.
So I've been trying to watch at least one horror movie a week during October just for the vibes. And a movie I recently watched that I got on high recommendation is The Lodge. Have you ever watched that movie?
Yes. Yeah, it was pretty good. I like that one.
Yeah. That movie I really like because it was an original take on because you kind of think you know what's going on, and I love the twist at the end of that movie. Kind of the double twist. There's a first twist in relation to the people in the house, and there's the other twist afterward. Yeah, really good. That actress, I think, needs to be in more stuff. I think she's a really good actress. Riley Keough, I think is her name. 'Cause I hadn't seen her before that movie.
She was in one called oh man.
There's a movie called The Invitation that I'm told I should watch too. That's also a horror movie.
Yeah, I think that just recently came out with
No, I don't think so. Let's see. I'm gonna look it up real quick. Okay,
like
so you're right. There is a movie called The Invitation that came out this year. That's not the one I'm thinking of. It's the one that came out in 2015.
Okay, then that one I think I have seen, and if it's what I'm thinking of, it's
A man accepts an invitation to a dinner party. It stars Logan Marshall Green, who's like knockoff.
Oh yeah, definitely watch that.
Tom Hardy.
It's really good.
Yeah, that's on my list too. So I'll that and Hereditary will be the two I make sure to watch this month. Yeah, that's it for our Halloween Spooktacular. Thank you guys for joining us. That was a fun episode. Talk about all the spookies. Like I said, we'll talk about what we've been playing and get back to the video game news next week. Other than that, you can follow us on YouTube at Controlled Interest. Search us up, like, subscribe, do all that stuff. Comment, let us know what your favorite Halloween memory is, your favorite horror movie or game we should check out. Other than that, you can follow us on Twitter, collectively at CTRLINT. It's Controlled Interest, it's abbreviated. You can follow me at Jerrad Wyche, that's JERRADWICHE. And you can follow Dom at OBDomKenobi, but the O in OB is the number 0, not the letter O. Thank you guys for listening on any Spotify, Google Play, any of the podcast services of your choice. Anything before we go on this Halloween Spooktacular, Dom?
Get yourself spooked.
Get yourself spooked. See you guys next week.